All right, Alexander, let's just jump into this video. We have the Russian economy lowering interest rates to 11%. The ruble is continues to strengthen. We have the this Reuters article that says that the European countries, a Reuters source, is saying that they've got some inside information that European countries only seized around 30 billion of Russian assets and foreign reserves, which is a far cry from the 300 billion. But Reuters also says that 100 billion has been claimed to have been seized by the United States. And we got to remember that the Russian government confirmed the 300 billion. So that makes this story a little interesting, a little odd. There we have the fact that the Russians have also opened up another sea lane in Ukraine. They had one that was already running. They've opened up a second one from Mariupol to via the Sea of Azov for ships to leave. Russia is pretty much saying, "Look, you've got two routes where ships could leave. So what's the deal with this naval blockade?" And then they're really publicizing this. And I'm trying to think, do we have another story? One more story, and then you could pick it up from there. Of course, you can talk about, maybe you want to talk about what's happening on the ground, though I think it would be good if you talked about it, but on your channel, you're doing a really comprehensive job of covering what's going on the ground. But I think it would be good if maybe you just do kind of a recap as to what's going on. Russia is winning there. Spoiler: Russia is winning in the Donbass. But the final story, which is also economics related, is that the oil embargo has completely collapsed. I got a story just like 20 minutes ago saying that all the oil is going through, name the country, Greece, and then the Greeks are shipping it to where? To India, to China. Record amounts of oil are going to India and China, and we talked about this on the Duran, that for all of his tough talk, Mitsotakis in front of Congress saying we are going to destroy Putin and we're going to defeat the tyranny of Russia and Putin, he comes back to Greece, and the Greek shippers who run the country sat Mitsotakis down and they said, "Don't you dare put an oil embargo." And Mitsotakis, of course, complied because he knows his place in the hierarchy, in the ladder of Greek power. But it just goes to show that the EU says many things, but reality is reality. And when it means that these guys have to stay in power, they will do what they need to do to stay in power. Anyway, I think that sums up all of these interesting stories that are going on. The rest of the video is yours. And just let me know if you forgot one of the topics that I mentioned, because I listed quite a lot.
No, I absolutely. But let's start with the seizure of the central bank reserves, because of course you're absolutely right. We got that story that $300 billion of reserves have been seized, and it seems that it was only 30 billion. And by the way, I've heard some rumors that the bulk of those were seized in France. So the Russians have clearly been taking steps, and I think this is true. And can I say why I think this is true? It is because the Russians, ever since that action was taken, have not been publishing the state of their central bank reserves. They allowed the story to circulate that 300 billion had been seized, and they appeared to confirm it. When you drill down carefully into their exact words, they never actually said that they had been seized. 300 billion had been seized. They sort of gave the impression that was the case, but they have consistently refused to actually release full information, in fact, publish information, updates on the state of their reserves. So it looks as if they ran rings around the West. They must have been expecting that something was going to happen. It's strange that they kept money in the United States and that the United States was able to see so much more, but possibly they were expecting that the legal protections of the US would be stronger, or maybe this is a poison pill thing, that they're waiting to create problems for the US when the legal cases, which we've discussed in the past, are brought by the bondholders who find it impossible to get payments and are going to blame the US government for that. But anyway, that I believe this Reuters report. I would have thought it was well sourced. I'm sure it's correct. That's the first thing to say. The second is, let's put aside this question of the reserves. Let's look at the actual state of the Russian economy today. And I'm going to say something. Now, nobody will ever accuse me of being a pessimist about the state of the Russian economy. I mean, read the vast bulk of commentary that you see about the Russian economy. I have always been somebody who has said that the Russian economy is massively underestimated. It's much bigger and much more diversified and far better run than people realize. It's much more diverse. It's certainly not one-dimensional. It's not, a petrol station masquerading as a country, or whatever it was that John McCain said. That all this is a complete misconception. Yet even I have been surprised at the speed of the turnaround. Now let's start with the interest rates. Interest rates before this crisis, before the war began, were at 10%. Then there was the sanctions against the central bank. Central bank pushed them up to 20%. They're now back at 11%. In other words, they're fractionally above where they were before the crisis. Secondly, we have had statements from Putin and from other Russian officials about the state of inflation. Now, there was a big inflationary surge in March. The first 2 weeks of March, prices rose because people rushed to the shops to buy things which they thought would be in short supply. That created a stress in the economy. That caused prices to skyrocket. And then they settled. So what we have been told is that the state of price increases in Russia up to now, that prices since the start of the year have risen by 11%. But Putin now tells us, and the Russian officials now tell us, that they're expecting that inflation overall this year in Russia will not be 18% as we thought, or 20%, or 22% as some people said. It's more likely going to be around 15%. Now, it can only be that if prices of key commodities like food and energy over the next few weeks and months are going to fall. So, inflation in Russia is going backwards, which is why the central bank is able to cut interest rates. It's also, by the way, why Putin, who is running one of the biggest budget surpluses in Russia's history, and we'll come to the oil and gas things in a moment, why Putin has money to increase pensions by 10%. And of course, he's doing that because that will compensate pensioners for the rise in prices earlier in the year. But he would only be doing that because he's a very cautious man. He would only be doing that if he generally believed the prices were under control. Now, the other thing, and we are both people who worked in business environments, and we had a discussion, I remember it very well, and we said that when all those companies pulled out, all those companies that make consumer goods or sell consumer goods in Russia, and of course it is in consumer goods that import penetration in Russia was greatest. We both said that consumer and services industries are the ones with the fastest turnaround. The people there are incredibly nimble. They're the quickest to find alternative suppliers. They're the quickest to restart production of things that have been, the gaps that exist in the economy. Well, we have been proved absolutely right. Apparently there's now a rush of producers coming forward, both within Russia and in places like Turkey, to make up for all the gaps that have appeared in the Russian market. And this is where I admit I have been most surprised by the speed of the turnaround. Even I've been surprised by how fast that turnaround is taking place. And that, of course, is also having a downward effect on the inflation, on the inflation within Russia. And then, of course, we come to the oil and gas. Well, I'm not going to say more than what you said. We said at the time that the moment they granted that waiver to the ship owners, allowing the Greek ship owners to ship Russian oil, the oil embargo was dead. And I'm going to say again what I've said before. A lot of that oil is going to China. The Chinese are busy rebuilding their strategic reserves. The Indians are buying more. But I suspect that when you go down into the real details, what you're going to find is that through all the usual middlemen, through all the paperwork, lots of it is ending up again in Europe. So the sanctions have failed in every conceivable way. They ended up making Russia stronger economically than it would have otherwise been. The best policy they could have followed at the start of this war is to do absolutely nothing, to keep the threat of sanctions alive. That might have caused people to be nervous. That might have resulted in many people taking their money out of Russia. What they did was they imposed reverse capital controls. They made it difficult, incredibly difficult for people to take money out of Russia. The result is that money is staying in Russia, as the Kremlin wants, and that is causing the economy there to strengthen and to grow. So well done, Jake Sullivan. Well done, Ursula von der Leyen. You've achieved the opposite of what you've intended. You created an economic and inflation crisis in the West, and you strengthened the Russian economy instead. Now, turning to the other quick topics, you're absolutely right.
One quick question.
Yeah.
One quick question, though, before you go to the other topics, and it's related to the oil. What are the chances that Ursula and Borrell and Michelle get their oil embargo? Because they're not giving up. What are the chances that they get the countries to agree? Do you think?
They might agree, though the Hungarians are now really resisting, and it seems to be that they're digging in their heels, and I guess the sense that the Italians are now are starting to shift position on it. But let's say they do achieve it. Let's say they do achieve it. As far as I can see, unless they reverse their position on the ship owners, which would, as you correctly say, create a political crisis in Greece, and by the way, a much bigger inflation crisis in Europe itself, because the oil producers, the oil industry is saying very clearly, you cannot replace Russian oil. Unless they change their position on the tankers, on the shipping, then this oil embargo would not only fail, it would actually increase oil prices, increasing the size of Putin's budget even further. It's very bizarre, but Ursula herself has actually, in an interview, and this is really weird, she's tried to say that the reason they haven't imposed an oil embargo is because that would help Putin. I mean, it's not what, on the one hand, she's trying to do one thing. On another hand, she's arguing the opposite.
She's walking it back.
She's walking it back. She's all over the place. But anyway, that's that business on the economic front. So the grain. Let's talk about the grain, as you rightly said. And by the way, this is perhaps an important thing to clarify. It seems that the Russians, they have a bumper harvest this year. They're a much bigger wheat producer than Ukraine is. They've reopened Mariupol's port, which was blocked by Ukraine, and they're making the point that the only people who are really preventing cargoes, merchant cargoes, grain ships leaving Odessa are the Ukrainians themselves. So the Russians have gone back. They're pushing back on that hard. And they're also making the absolutely correct point that the real problem, the real reason why there is a food crisis is not because of the Russian blockade, but because of all those restrictions that have been placed on Russian and Belarusian potash and fertilizer exports. And, way back in October, people like Jacob Dreisen was saying that with the way in which the gas was being mismanaged by the European Union, there would be shortages of fertilizer, and this was going to create major food shortages across the world this year and create a further inflation spike. And it seems to me that Dreisen is right. The Russians are right about the food embargo. I still think that we're going to be in the position that you predicted in our previous video, that sometime around the autumn, when the real situation in food is becoming really desperate, we're going to get wheat for rubles. I mean, that's coming. We're going to get oil for rubles before very long. That's also coming. But that's the trajectory of travel on that. And on the military front, I'm going to be brief summary here. Russians are continuing steady advances in Donbass. Ukrainian troops there are now essentially encircled. We've had information today, another Ukrainian town there, a place called Liman, is either fully or largely under Russian control. The central administration building there is now showing a Russian flag. The Ukrainians themselves are showing increasing signs of panic. They're talking about the fact that they're outnumbered 20-1 in material, 7-1 in men, that they're not getting the weapons that the West has promised, that NATO, this is from the foreign minister Kuleba, that NATO has proved a paper tiger, that it's done nothing for Ukraine, which I have to say I find astonishing. If NATO has really done nothing for Ukraine, then why do you want to join NATO? I mean, it seems bizarre. But anyway, that's what they're saying. So on every front, on every point that you've been making, that we've been discussing on these programs, it is increasingly looking like a debacle. Just as you said, that we are in a previous video, we are heading towards a debacle. And the danger is that the Poles, that the encouragement of the Poles to get involved in Ukraine, and that would be very dangerous. And the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, the spokesman, yesterday warned the Poles against mission creep. She said, you are now in a mission creep situation. You need to be very careful, because if you continue along this road, it's going to turn out very badly for you. So we are in a debacle, or at least the early stages of one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just a final question. I think we've summed it up perfectly well. I mean, look, Russia is winning across the board, if you want my opinion. The military side of things, the economic side of things. I even think the media side of things is starting to turn. And I think it's starting to turn because a lot of people in the West are also losing interest in the Ukraine story. They're just not as invested into it anymore.
Exactly.
And they've moved on to the next thing in the news cycle. And that's not good for Zelensky and his regime. And they're trying desperately to keep Ukraine in the news cycle. And as they try desperately to keep Ukraine in the news cycle, they come up with more fantastical stories, and it just discredits. It discredits them as well, if you could even discredit them at this point in time. Yes. It's circular, but if I was, my question to you is, if me or you were we're working for Brussels and working for Ursula von der Leyen, and we were sitting at her table and we were looking at the picture of what's going on, the best advice would be to tell her to give up, wouldn't it? It's over.
Absolutely.
Retreat. Because we talk about Ukraine retreating and cutting a deal. It would be, look, Ursula, Joseph Borrell, it's over. Retreat. Let's live as the EU, as the European Union, and as a bunch of technocrats here at this table. Let's live to fight another day. Because if we continue going in this direction, there's not going to be a European Union in a year or two. So at least let's retreat. Let's move to safer ground. Let's live to fight another day. It's over. Let's try to find a diplomatic deal in Ukraine. We're going to have to give up a lot of land. We're going to have to grovel to Russia. But Russia will probably give us some sort of diplomatic off-ramp, most likely. Though I don't know, maybe not. But it's over. That's how I'm seeing it. I could be wrong. Maybe the EU has something up their sleeve. Maybe there's going to be this offensive in August with 1 million soldiers that Arestovich and Zelensky are talking about. I don't know, but today, as it stands, I'm looking at everything as objectively as I possibly can. It's a victory across the board.
Yes.
Am I wrong? Maybe
No,
I
you're
am.
absolutely right.
But
You're
what do you
absolutely
think
right.
about the statement I made? If you were sitting with Ursula, what would you tell her?
I would be telling her exactly that. They've been comprehensively outplayed. They didn't understand who they were taking on. You never reinforce failure, because this is failing. And what you now do is you look for an off-ramp. And by the way, I think the Russians...
Good money after bad. So
it's good money after
yeah.
bad, exactly. I mean, the Russians are incandescently angry. I mean, we need to understand that. But I still think they're just sufficiently, sober-minded that they would probably give the EU some kind of an off-ramp. I mean, as Putin said today, apparently, the sanctions have worked to our advantage. So, the Russians would probably say, well, all right, let's keep the sanctions. Let's allow some of the sanctions to stay there at least for a while. And then, we look for a political solution. But, not guaranteed, but I think the Russians would give an off-ramp. But even if they're not prepared to give an off-ramp, to change the metaphor, what we say in Britain, if you are in a hole, stop digging. Stop pursuing oil embargoes, gas embargoes, more restrictions, more asset seizures, all of these things. Try to find a way to tamp this thing down. The trouble is, I don't know that she is going to listen to that advice. I suspect that any advisor, any EU official who comes along and gives her that kind of advice is going to be out of a job. Because I don't think that she's capable of hearing that advice at the moment. And that's the trouble. I think that one of the problems with people like Ursula is not just that these are ideological people, which of course they are, and which is that it's driving him in that direction. But after all that she said, after all the rhetorical poses that she's, struck, I think she probably feels, however, much we may joke about how EU officials, however badly they fail, they always rise. But I feel that she will probably feel that the loss of face and the loss of credibility, if she stops or if the EU stops, would be ultimately fatal for whatever future she may still be hoping for. But having said that, you're asking me about what the advice would be. Well, it's exactly the advice that you suggested.
Yeah, but they're destroying Ukraine in the process.
They're destroying you.
That's
That's the point. That for me is the clincher. They're destroying Ukraine in the process, and they're creating an economic crisis in Europe. We now have had, by the way, a massive vote in Britain for a rail strike, which will paralyse much of the British economy. Now, Britain, of course, is not in the EU, but it's still connected to the European economy. We're going to see much more of that if we continue along this road.
And a final thought is I definitely believed the 300 billion in foreign reserves were confiscated. What a judo move by the Russian government.
Well,
what
absolutely.
A judo move.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, it's true. Yes. Yeah. I mean, never underestimate them, as I said, and note how cleverly they've played this. I mean, not only did they not let all of their reserves be seized in the way that we thought, but they did it in a way, they let everybody for months think otherwise, except for the senior officials in the West, so that, they've played this with great skill. Never underestimate them.
And it's probably the amount of reserves stolen is about say 100 billion in the US and 30. So they got say 130. That would be probably a good estimate, you think? 150 up or down.
Up or down, exactly. So they still have about 500 billion of those reserves in their pocket. So I mean, which is growing all the time. So probably by now it's already been exceeded. But as I said, they've played it very skillfully and very well, and I suspect it's only probably now fully, only now, as European governments have been talking to each other, have they found out the extent to which the Russians outplayed them.
Can I make one final? I said this is going to be a short video, but I'm going to make one final comment and tell me if I'm wrong. But looking at how they played the foreign reserves game, God, did they play it well? I'm kind of stunned at it. But I bet you they're doing the same thing with regards to how many weapons they have and their weapon stockpiles. Because I read a report yesterday saying that the Ukrainian military saying that Russia has run through 60% of all their missiles and they're almost tapped out. You get the reports from the West as well, the collective West, saying Russia's almost tapped out of weapons and missiles, and in a couple of months it's going to end. Russia never really says, they never have said, what they have and what they don't have. I bet you they have enough firepower for this to last for another year and a half, 2 years. And I bet you they're just cranking out more and more
Absolutely.
missiles and weapons as well without telling anybody, just being quiet. That's the hunch that I'm getting.
That's exactly
And
my
it's a
view
hunch.
too. It's a hunch, but I'm sure it's the correct one. I as I said before, even I underestimated the scale and resilience of the Russian economy. So nobody would ever accuse me, as I said, of saying of under talking it. So there we go. And I'm sure you're right about the military things. I see no evidence, by the way, of any slackening in the Russian missile effort. I mean, this is all based on the fact that because of the fighting in Donbass, there's many more Russian aircraft in the air, but that's not a sign that they're running out of missiles. It's a sign that the battle in Donbass is heating up in exactly the way that the Russians wanted.
All right, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com and Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.